Tonight, I invite you to step quietly into a candlelit room in London, where a young girl's story begins not with crown, but with single whispered hope. The year is 1836. Rain falls softly against the tall windows of Kensington Palace. Inside, 17-year-old Victoria sits at a small wooden desk, her diary open before her. The only light comes from a single candle, its flame dancing across the page as she writes. She is not yet queen, only a princess living under strict rules called the Kensington system. Every morning, her mother and Sir John Conroy decide where she walks, whom she meets, even what book she reads. Heavy doors close behind her wherever she goes. Distant church bells mark the hours. But time moves slowly in these silent halls. Victoria wears simple dresses of muslin and silk, but she feels anything but free. She practices French verbs until her hand aches. She takes supervised walks in the palace gardens, never allowed to speak to strangers. At dinner, she sits quietly while her mother and Conroy discuss politics in low, urgent voices behind closed doors. Sometimes she hears their whispers through the walls, words like succession and William's health. She does not fully understand, but she feels the weight of waiting in the air around her. In her diary, she writes one sentence again and again: I will be good. I will be strong. She does not know that King William IV grows weaker each day. She does not know that soon, very soon, a midnight messenger will run through these very halls, and everything will change. But on this night, as rain tapped against her window, Victoria felt a strange certainty. Her waiting would soon be over. Every morning began the same way. At 6 o'clock sharp, a maid entered Victoria's room without knocking. The girl would rise instantly, no lingering under blankets. She dressed in clothes chosen the night before. Then came 2 hours of lessons, geography with maps spread across cold tables, French with a strict tutor who corrected her accent with a ruler's tap, chalk scratched against slate as she practiced sums. The scent of lemon polish filled the air, but beneath it lingered something heavier, the weight of the Kensington system. These were the rules designed to keep her small, obedient, and dependent. After lessons, Victoria walked in the palace gardens, always accompanied, always watched. One afternoon, she saw a gardener's daughter chasing a butterfly near the roses. The child laughed, a bright, free sound. Victoria took one step toward her. Immediately, her governess's hand closed around her wrist. Princess, the woman whispered, you do not speak to servants. Victoria nodded silently, but inside, a quiet frustration stirred. She was almost 18. She could read 3 languages, yet she could not choose a friend. The real tension arrived on a Tuesday in May. Sir John Conroy entered her sitting room unannounced, his boots clicking on marble floors. He placed a document before her. Sign here, he said, pointing to a blank line. This makes me your private secretary when you become queen. Victoria studied his face, the sharp eyes, the tight smile. She felt no trust, only a cold certainty. This man wanted her crown's shadow, not her well-being. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached the pen. Then she paused. I will not sign today, she said softly. Conroy's smile vanished. You will regret this disobedience, he warned before leaving. That night, alone with her candle, Victoria opened her diary. The room felt peaceful. Rain whispered against the glass. For a few precious minutes, she was simply herself. She wrote 2 words carefully on a fresh page: I will be free. The words felt like a secret promise. She traced the letters with her finger imagining a life without constant watching. She thought this small act of rebellion would go unnoticed. She was wrong. The knock came just after midnight. Sharp, insistent. Victoria woke instantly, her heart pounding. A servant stood breathless in her doorway. "The king is dead," he whispered. "You are queen." In that moment, everything changed. She rose without hesitation, dressed in a simple black dress, and walked into the red drawing room where her mother and Conroy waited. But something had shifted in her. The girl who once trembled before Conroy now stood straight, her voice clear and steady. "I will see my prime minister alone," she announced. Conroy's face tightened with shock. For the first time, he had no power here. At dawn on June 20th, 1837, Victoria became queen. She was just 18. In her first act as sovereign, she banished Conroy from her inner circle. Her mother wept in protest, but Victoria would not bend. She was queen, truly queen. Yet power brought its own loneliness. She turned to Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, a kind man with gentle eyes and a soft laugh. He guided her through council meetings, explaining politics with patience. She grew to trust him deeply, perhaps too deeply. At balls, she sought his company above all others. She laughed at his jokes. She deferred to his advice in public. Soon, newspapers rustled with whispers. The Queen leans too heavily on Melbourne. Is he ruling Britain? Or is she? Victoria heard the rumors but dismissed them. He felt like the one safe harbor in a stormy sea. One evening, sitting alone in the throne room after a long day, she watched dust motes dance in the fading light. The crown felt heavy on her brow. Can I trust anyone? She wondered. Or will they all want something from me? The thought chilled her. Even kindness might have a price. Her coronation day arrived in June 1838. London bloomed with flags and flowers. Crowds roared her name as she rode through streets glittering with celebration. For hours, she smiled, waved, felt the sun warm on her face, a queen beloved by her people. But when the carriage finally returned to Buckingham Palace, silence rushed in like cold water. Servants bowed and disappeared down shadowed halls. The grand rooms felt vast and empty. She stood at a window, watching the last fireworks fade over the Thames. The cheers had vanished. Only her own breath remained. She believed Melbourne would steady her reign. But a deeper loneliness was waiting in the shadows. A letter arrived from Germany in the autumn of 1839. Its seal bore the crest of her cousin Albert, a match her family had planned since childhood. Victoria read it with a sinking feeling. Marriage meant sharing her throne, her decisions, her very life. She had fought so hard for independence. Now duty demanded she surrendered again. At dinner that week, her uncle pressed the matter. "Albert is intelligent," he said. "He will strengthen the monarchy." Victoria nodded politely, but inside she resisted. She pictured a cold political union, another set of rules disguised as love. Then Albert arrived at Windsor Castle on a rainy October afternoon. Victoria watched from an upstairs window as his carriage rolled through the gates. She expected a proud prince, eager for power. Instead, she saw a young man stepping carefully onto wet gravel, adjusting his coat with quiet grace. When they met in the drawing room, He did not bow too deeply or speak too eagerly. He simply looked at her, really looked and smiled. Not a courtier smile, but something warmer. Real. They walked together in the gardens the next day, rain misting their shoulders. Albert spoke of music he composed, of engineering sketches filling his notebooks. He asked about her work, not to flatter, but because he listened when a servant dropped a tray nearby. Albert knelt instantly to help gather the scattered spoons. No one of his rank did that. Victoria felt something shift inside her, a wall she hadn't known was there, softening. That evening, writing in her diary by firelight, she admitted a truth she'd hidden even from herself. He sees me. Not the Queen. Me. Weeks passed. Albert prepared to return to Germany. The palace felt dimmer without him. One morning, Victoria stood at her window, watching gray clouds gather over the Thames. Her throat tightened with a fear she could no longer ignore. If he left, she might never find such kindness again. The crown felt heavy. Yes, but loneliness felt heavier. She made her choice not as a queen fulfilling duty, but as a woman choosing her own heart. She sent for him. When he entered her private study, she stood without her crown. "Albert," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have made a decision. I wish you to stay. I wish to marry you." His eyes widened, not with triumph, but with tenderness. He took her hands. "It would be my honor," he said. As she slipped the ring onto his finger, she could not know this love would one day become her greatest sorrow. 9 children arrived in 17 years. Each birth brought both joy and exhaustion. Victoria loved her babies deeply, their tiny fingers their first smiles, but her body ached with the strain. After Prince Leopold's difficult delivery in 1853, she lay in bed for weeks, too weak to hold him. Rain fell against the nursery windows as she listened to his cries from down the hall. "I am queen," she thought, "yet I cannot even lift my own son." Albert sat beside her each evening, reading poetry until her breathing steadied. His presence was her anchor, but even he carried his own quiet battles. Albert worked tirelessly behind the scenes, reviewing state papers, designing improvements for royal estates, advising on foreign affairs. Yet newspapers still called him the husband or the foreigner. Parliament refused to grant him an official title for years. Victoria saw the hurt in his eyes when he returned from meetings where ministers dismissed his ideas. One night, he slammed his study door, a rare outburst. "I give everything," he told her, voice trembling, "and still I am nobody." She reached for his hand. "You are my somebody," she whispered. But the words felt too small against his frustration. Outside the palace walls, trouble grew. In 1848, revolution swept across Europe, kings overthrown, streets running with blood. Victoria watched anxiously as crowds gathered near Buckingham Palace. She held her newborn daughter close, wondering if British soil would burn next. Albert stood guard at the window all night, a pistol within reach. They spoke little, but his steady presence kept her fear at bay. Then came hope. Albert poured his heart into planning the Great Exhibition of 1851, a celebration of human invention housed in a glittering crystal palace. For months, he barely slept, sketching designs, negotiated with engineers, calming doubters. When opening day arrived, Victoria walked beside him through halls filled with steam engines, jewels, and wonders from every continent. Sunlight poured through glass walls, painting rainbows on his face. The crowd's roar swelled around them. In that moment, she saw pure joy in his eyes, the kind she'd rarely witnessed. He had created beauty the world would remember, but the triumph cost him dearly. Days after the exhibition closed, Albert collapsed in his study, feverish and coughing. Doctors called it nervous exhaustion. He recovered slowly, but shadow remained, a weariness that clung to his shoulders. Victoria watched him push through the pain, still working late into the night. She begged him to rest. He only smiled faintly. "There is still so much to do," he said. They celebrated that victory together. It would be their last moment of true peace. December 1861 brought a deep cold to Windsor Castle. Albert had fallen ill after walking the rain to inspect a drainage problem on the estate, a simple chill that twisted into something darker. Typhoid fever. For 2 weeks, Victoria never left his bedside. She held cool cloths to his forehead, read to him in a voice that trembled, and listened to his labored breathing fill the silent room. The scent of lilies and damp will hung thick in the air. Doctors came and went with grim faces. Albert grew weaker each hour, his hands growing cold in hers. On the evening of December 14th, he opened his eyes one last time. He looked at her, not at the Queen, but at Victoria, and whispered a single word, "My love." Then his breath stilled. The room fell into a silence deeper than any she had ever known. Victoria did not weep at first. She simply sat, his hand still cradled in hers, watching the candlelight flicker across his peaceful face. Hours passed. Night deepened. Servants entered quietly to light more candles, to adjust the blankets. Still she did not move. When dawn broke, pale and gray, she remained in the same chair. On the second day, ministers arrived, Lord Palmerston among them, bowing stiffly at the doorway. "Your Majesty," Palmerston began gently, "the nation requires your presence. Parliament awaits." Victoria did not turn her head. "The nation may wait," she said, her voice flat and distant. "My husband will not." Palmerston exchanged uneasy glances with the others. They retreated, but returned the next morning with greater urgency. The people grew anxious. One insisted, "You must show yourself." That was when something broke inside her. She rose slowly from the chair, her black dress wrinkled and stained with tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. She faced them, her eyes burning with a grief too raw for words. "Leave me," she cried, her voice cracking like ice. "Do you think crowns matter now? Do you think politics matter? He is gone. The world means nothing now." She sank back into her chair, pulling Albert's cold hand to her cheek. In that moment, a single thought echoed through her shattered heart. If I step outside this room, I will lose him forever. His memory will fade in the noise of duties and crowds. Here, with him, he is still real. For 3 days she stayed. She refused food. She barely slept. She spoke only to him, whispering memories, promises, apologies for times she'd been impatient. Servants left trays untouched outside the door. The only sounds were the guttering of candles, the soft rustle of her dress, and muffled sobs pressed into his still shoulder. When finally she allowed them to prepare his body for burial, she placed a lock of her hair in his pocket and kissed his forehead one last time. Darkness. Silence. Him gone. She buried him in white, vowing never to smile again. But time has a way of softening even the hardest hearts. For 10 long years, Victoria wore black. Every dress, every ribbon, every handkerchief, a silent testament to a love that death could not erase. She withdrew from public life, retreating to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight or Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. Newspapers grew harsh. They called her the Widow of Windsor, a ghost haunting her own kingdom. Cartoons showed an empty throne draped in crape. Politicians whispered that a queen who hid from her people was no queen at all. But Victoria did not care. In her private rooms, she kept Albert's dressing gown laid out each morning, as if he might return. She had his voice preserved in wax cylinders, fragments of speeches she played on lonely evenings, just to hear his tone again. The weight of the crown had become the weight of memory. Yet life has a gentle persistence. It arrived first through John Brown, her Scottish servant at Balmoral. He spoke little, but his presence was steady, a man who treated her not as a queen, but as a grieving woman. He walked beside her on misty highland paths, never rushing her silences. He brought her tea without asking, and once, when she stumbled on a rocky path, his hand caught her elbow without ceremony. No bow, no title, just human kindness. Slowly, almost without noticing, she began taking short walks beyond the castle gates. Then she accepted a single official document to sign. Then another. Her children became her next bridge back. Her eldest son, Edward, whom Albert had worried was too frivolous, surprised her with unexpected maturity after his father's death. He sat with her for hours, sharing news from London not as demands, but as gentle updates. "The people still love you, Mama," he said one afternoon, placing a bouquet of heather on her desk. "They don't want a perfect queen. They want you." Something in his words loosened a knot inside her she hadn't known was tied. The true twist of Victoria's story lies not in her return to duty, but in what her sorrow created without her intending it. While she mourned in private, the nation absorbed her grief. An entire era took shape around absence. Stiff collars, somber parlors, moral seriousness etched into the age's character. The Victorian age, as history would name it, was born not from triumph, but from loss. She never sought to define a century. She only loved one man deeply. Yet that love, and its ending, left an imprint deeper than any policy or war. In her final years, Victoria sat often at Osborne House, watching the sea whisper against chalk cliffs. In her lap rested a small velvet box. Inside, Albert's photograph, faded at the edges. She would trace his face with a trembling finger, then close the lid and breathe deeply. The grief never vanished. It simply made room for other things: grandchildren's laughter, the smell of sea air, the quiet pride of a reign lasting 63 years. She had carried sorrow like a second crown, and in doing so, she taught a nation that even broken hearts can hold great strength. Her story seemed to end in sorrow. But when we look closer, we see something unexpected. Let's walk through Victoria's story again, slowly, like remembering a dream. Victoria was a lonely girl. She lived in Kensington Palace in London. She was never alone. Her mother and Sir John Conroy watched her always. They made strict rules. She could not walk downstairs without someone beside her. She could not speak to visitors alone. Victoria felt small inside the big palace, but she kept a secret diary. She wrote her true thoughts there. She dreamed of freedom. Then King William became ill. One morning in June 1837, a knock came at her door before sunrise. The king had died. Victoria was now queen. She was only 18 years old. That same day, she moved her bed out of her mother's room. She was alone at last, and she was free. Prime Minister Lord Melbourne became her guide. He taught her about ruling a kingdom. She trusted him deeply. But then she met Albert. He was her cousin from Germany. They met in a sunlit room. Victoria looked at him and felt something new. She proposed to him 3 days later. She chose love. They married in white satin. They built a happy home together. They had 9 children. They laughed during picnics. They played music in the evenings. Albert became her closest advisor. He worked beside her every day. The British Empire grew larger. There were troubles everywhere. Revolutions in Europe. Unrest in the colonies. Albert worked late into the night. He studied maps and letters. He grew tired. He ignored his cough that winter. Then he fell ill with fever. Victoria stayed by his bed. She held his hand. But Albert died in December 1861. Victoria's world went dark. She wore black for the rest of her life. She left London. She lived quietly in Scotland. The people called her the Widow of Windsor. They were angry she disappeared. But Victoria could not face the world without Albert. For 10 years, she stayed hidden. Then a Scottish servant named John Brown spoke to her kindly. He treated her like a person, not a queen. Slowly, she began to walk outside again. She felt the sun on her face. Victoria never forgot Albert, but she learned to carry her grief. She returned to her duties. She ruled for 63 years. She became the grandmother of Europe. Her grandchildren married into royal families across the continent. She was no longer the lonely girl in Kensington Palace. She had known deep love. She had known deep loss. And she had learned to carry both. Victoria's story is a human story, not just a queen story. A story of a heart that loved, lost, and kept walking. I was 17 years old, and I was never alone. Not for a single minute. My mother and Sir John Conroy walked beside me everywhere. Down the palace stairs. Through the garden paths. Even when I wrote in my diary, I listened for footsteps outside my door. I felt like a bird in a golden cage. Beautiful walls. No sky. Then one morning at 6 o'clock, a knock came. Sharp. Urgent. A servant stood there, pale-faced. The king is dead. You are queen. I walked into the red drawing room alone. For the first time in my life, truly alone. And I felt something strange. Not fear, but strength. I signed my name Victoria R. My hand did not shake. That afternoon, I moved my bed out of my mother's room. I slept alone. I breathed alone. It was the sweetest freedom I had ever known. I met Albert 2 years later. He walked into the room, and the air changed. He did not bow too deeply. He looked at me, really looked, and smiled. Not at the Queen. At me. 3 days later, I asked him to marry me. I chose my own heart. Our life together was not perfect. There were state papers and public duties. But in our private rooms, we were simply Victoria and Albert. I heard his footsteps in the hall, and my heart lifted. I saw his tired eyes after long nights of work, and I brought him tea with my own hands. He was my partner, my home. Then December 1861 came. Albert grew pale. A fever took him. I sat by his bed for days. I held his hand until it grew cold. When he left me, the world lost its color. I wore black. I covered the mirrors. I could not bear to see my own face without him beside me. For 10 years, I hid in Scotland. The people call me selfish. Perhaps I was. But how do you rule a kingdom when your own heart has stopped beating? Then John Brown came. A simple Scottish servant with rough hands and honest eyes. He did not call me your majesty with fear in his voice. He said, "The sun is warm today. Ma'am, you should walk outside." And slowly, I did. I felt the wind on my face again. I heard birds singing. Albert was still gone. But I learned something important. Grief is not a room you leave behind. It is a weight you learn to carry. And you can still walk while carrying it. I ruled for 63 years. I was a girl who was never alone. A queen who found love. A widow who learned to breathe again. I carried my loss. And I carried my crown. Both were heavy. Both were mine. The story of Queen Victoria is not really about crowns or palaces. It is about a human heart, lonely, then loved, then broken, then slowly healing. She was a girl who lived under watchful eyes. She became a queen who chose her own path. She found a love that felt like coming home. And when that love was taken from her, she learned the hardest lesson of all, how to carry grief without letting it crush her completely. We do not overcome our deepest losses. We learn to carry them while still walking forward. Perhaps you have carried something heavy too, a goodbye, a dream that faded, a silence where a voice used to be. Victoria's story reminds us that grief and love are woven together. The deeper the love, the heavier the loss. But also, the more beautiful the memory. You do not need to forget to move forward. You only need to learn how to hold what you lost while still reaching for the light ahead. If this story helped your English tonight, if you understood Victoria's loneliness or her love or her slow return to the world, you can gently support this channel. Tap like below if one moment stayed with you. Subscribe for more true stories told slowly, with care for your listening ears. And if you wish, write one word in the comments, love or loss. Just one word. So we remember together that every heart knows both. Now the candles in Windsor Castle have long been extinguished. The carriages have stilled. But Victoria's story remains, not as a history lesson, but as a quiet truth whispered across time. That even queens feel small. That even the strongest hearts break. And that after the longest winter, a single step outside toward the sun, toward a kind voice, toward life again, is sometimes the bravest thing we ever do. Thank you for listening with your heart tonight. Rest well. And remember, you are never alone in what you carry.